Okay, I think we're going to get started. We've got a new revolution today. There's going to be two $5 prizes. And one $5 prize I'm going to award for the best, what I think is the best question. Then Duncan is going to choose maybe another question. I don't know. I suppose we could choose the same question and somebody could get $10, but that's not too likely, I don't think. But anyway, there's going to be two $5 prizes, okay? So I think that one of the big problems these days is people aren't very healthy. And you'll see as we go through this how it rolls, okay? Now, Duncan, are you recording this or you just have this live? You're recording it. Okay, so, all right. So food and nutrition that oppose health and brain function. And there's lots of nutritional health problems. People, if they go to the medical system, tend to be over-medicated with pharmaceuticals that just deal with symptoms, but don't deal with, in most cases, the underlying problem. Some people don't go the pharmaceutical route. They do their own dope or alcohol cure, right? But that doesn't treat the underlying problems either, okay? And so I think that the evidence is overwhelming that the major health problem in the United States and much of the world is caused by too much omega-6. I'll explain this in great excruciating detail. Fatty acids and too low a level of omega-3. And you'll see this as we roll. Second, excessive sugar and fructose, which is equally as harmful as excessive alcohol. And both drive fatty liver. Both fructose and alcohol drive fatty liver in a very parallel way. And that causes increases in type 2 diabetes. It also is related to depression and probably Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, which are growing and growing and growing and growing. They're going to eat us all alive. American diets are also low in a wide range of other key nutrients, magnesium, zinc, folate, many B vitamins, copper, selenium, that lead to decreased health. But there's very little awareness of this. And conventional medicine does not screen for most of these nutrients. There's a few doctors out there who are self-educated in nutrition and will screen for these things. But it's just a few percent of them because they don't get the right kind of training. And so there we are. So here's a study. It's a kind of a complex slide, but I'll just highlight a few things. This was published in Science magazine a little while ago. And what this guy did is pull together a lot of data that was out there in the literature. Now, Science magazine, you're not scientists, so you probably don't realize, this is the most prestigious place to publish in the United States and the world. Well, also Nature is equally prestigious. So these papers are very heavily reviewed and looked at very hard. So this is really pretty good stuff. So I got a big pointer here. And I won't go through all these, but what they did here, they took blood samples from disadvantaged young people, and then they measured what percent are getting adequate intakes of these things, okay? And there's some pretty low numbers here, and I won't go through all of them, but zinc is a big one, okay? It's in over 100 enzymes, it's essential, on and on. Low intakes have been associated with ADHD and criminality, okay? People in prison have very low zinc. And there's lots and lots of studies of, I think, up to about 30,000 or maybe more people now in prison where they're given absorbable zinc supplements and they fight with each other less, they fight with the guards less, and they get more interested in rehabilitation. Just with a little bit of zinc, okay? And also, it turns out, very timely now, that low zinc is makes you more susceptible to all kinds of COVID-type viruses, which include flu and COVID and, well, any kind of virus in that family. So low zinc I won't really have time to go into that in detail, but you should look into it. And I'll just say one thing on that. Zinc lozenges, you have to suck on them in your mouth to get good absorption. And I could talk and talk and talk on this, but if you're interested in this, there's many papers in the literature now that say zinc supplementation cures COVID very quickly, stops it in its tracks. Just with pennies worth of zinc that you suck in your mouth, if you swallow it, it's not absorbed efficiently, and we could go into that. There could be a question on that, but let's not prompt you on questions, okay? So here's another one, selenium. 0% of them are adequate selenium. Now this is just adequate. That doesn't mean even adequate is optimum. The adequate level is something that where you don't get obviously sick, but it may not be anywhere near close to optimum level. And low intakes reduce cognitive function and autism. Now there's more and more papers saying that autism is correlated with low selenium. And then here's what I think is the most important one, essential fatty acids. So you can get these from grass-fed animals, wild game, or fish. 0% of the kids had adequate amounts of that. And what do you get if you don't have enough omega-3s? Impaired attention, impulsive behavior, reduced memory, impaired cognition, depression, and excess inflammation. We're going to hammer through a lot of this stuff as we go along, okay? So many people may avoid fat, don't eat fat, don't eat fat. But it's very bad advice. The type of fat you eat is super, super important. And if you do avoid eating fat, you have to eat something, and you tend to eat too many sugars and carbohydrates. And it turns out, you see, that fats are satiating. That means if you eat fats, then you feel satisfied. You don't feel like you always want to eat something more. But if you eat that Cinnabon or whatever it is that's high in carbs and sugar, your blood sugar goes up like a shot and then usually crashes, and then you want another Cinnabon or something else, right? You get on this roller coaster of high sugar and carb. But if you had plain fat, you'd probably, if you smothered, a Cinnabon is horrible, but if you smothered it with butter, half-inch thick, that might help. But anyway, let's go on here. Okay, 3 types of fat, main ones. Saturated fat, not essential, but extremely healthy. And I'll mention this a little bit. I could make a whole talk about how healthy saturated fat is. There's something called omega-6 fat, and I'll explain what that is. It's essential. Our bodies can't make this, and we need some of this for disease resistance. Omega-3 fat is essential. Our bodies can't make this, and we need it for brain function and all kinds of health. Okay, so 6 and 3 and saturated. So omega-6 produces inflammation, and we need this in moderate amounts for our immune system to work. But if you have too many 6s compared to 3s, the body has excess inflammation, and that makes the body immune system overactive and overaggressive, and you get excessive inflammation. You get increased risk of all kinds of things. Asthma, allergies, autism, headaches, obesity, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, heart disease, and a very large fraction of cancers. Okay? If you have too much inflammation, it's like shooting a shotgun at your DNA. Blammo! And your DNA is heavily disrupted. A lot of the cells just die, but occasionally one will take off and grow, and bad news. But now the worst news is with high 6, the brain is starved for omega-3. They compete with each other, okay? If you have too much 6, that makes you less able to use the 3 you've got. So this risks anxiety, depression, substance abuse, ADHD, and Alzheimer's. If people are anxious and depressed, what do they tend to do? They have a little doobie, or they have some alcohol, or maybe both, and they feel a little better for a short time. But it doesn't get at the underlying problem, okay? All right, let's go. So where do you get 6? Most processed foods have way too much 6, and I'll go into this in more detail. It's corn, soy, lots of other oils, peanut oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, almost every plant oil. It's way too much 6. Way, way too much 6. Peanut oil has 200 times too much 6. Okay. Fish and other seafood are the best source of omega-3, but green veggies have some. And you can't afford eating a lot of good fish, but you can get purified, the brain active part of the fish oil, purified in little pills, pretty cheap, and I'll talk about that a little more as we go on. Okay, so your body needs dozens of different fatty acids, and your body can produce all of them by itself, except 2. One is called linoleic acid, omega-6. That's what's in all these plant oils. ALA, alpha-linolenic acid. You don't have to remember LA and ALA is good to remember, but if you can. And that's an omega-3. So they're called essential fatty acids, or EFAs. And if you don't have enough of these, you're SOL, okay? So you need some 6, not too much. So the balance of 6 to 3 is crucial. And we don't actually know what the best balance is. It's probably around 2.5 to 1, because that's how our bodies, our forebears evolved, because wild game is 2.5 to 1. And grass-fed animals, grass-fed beef, lamb, whatever you got, is 2.5 to 1. And truly pasture-raised chickens are 2.5 to 1. That's not ones that are so-called free range, because the free range ones they let run outside, which is fine, but they feed them the same corn, soy food that the inside chickens get. But if the chickens run around outside and eat bugs and worms and grass, they come up with about 2.5 to 1, 6 to 3. And their eggs are also that way. So they have to be truly pasture raised. And it's hard to find that these days. But the modern American diet, a lot of people call the MAD diet, has about a 15 to 1 to 30 to 1 ratio of 6 to 3. And that's too much inflammation. Okay? It's just way too much inflammation. So this is optional. You don't have to know this. You guys don't probably have much chemistry, but maybe you remember a little bit vaguely from back in high school or something, or maybe earlier, I don't know. So what we got here is these little, I'll just run through this because some of you may be interested in this. So these little blue ones here are oxygens, and that little green one is a hydrogen, and all these sort of reddish ones are carbons. Okay, so it's a long carbon chain. And I don't show all the hydrogens. These are called hydrocarbons. But there's single bonds between the carbons, and then there are double bonds in some places. So if you've got double bonds in fats, they're called unsaturated because they can do other reactions and become saturated very easily. But if you got more than one double bond, they're polyunsaturated, which you've probably heard of. Okay? So what happens is you've got 2 ends of these fats. The oxygen end, which is called the alpha end, and all the way down under here is the omega end. So it's the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and omega. And so the difference between an omega-3 and omega-6 is you go down to the omega end and you count carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you come to the first double bond. That's an omega-6. And if you go to the omega end on the other one, and count 1, 2, 3, you come to the first double bond at the third carbon. That's an omega-3. And we can't change the omega number. We don't have the enzymes. We can add double bonds at the alpha end. We can make it longer at the alpha end, and that'll turn out to be really important in a minute. But this is what the omega-3 and omega-6 really are. And you don't have to know this, but some of you might be interested to know what it really is, okay? So, but now, these are the ones that tend to be high in our diet, these two, 3 and 6. But the ones that really have the punch in our bodies, the most bioactive, are long-chain omega-3s. And these are the ones that are rich in fish oil. But we can actually make these in our bodies. We can make these from this ALA, the omega-3, the short. So this one is 20 carbons and 5 double bonds. This one is 22 carbons and 6 double bonds, both omega-3s. We can make those out of this 18 carbon ALA, 3 double bonds. if the 6 isn't too high. But it turns out 6 and 3 compete with each other in our liver, in our bodies. And if the 6 is high, we can't really make use of that ALA that we eat very well. But EPA, I won't, well, you could know the whole name, but people usually don't say that. Eicosapentaenoic acid, that's why they say EPA, because that's kind of a mouthful. But it's got 20 carbons, 5 double bonds omega-3, 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is very anti-inflammatory. And this other one, DHA, that stands for docosahexaenoic acid. Well, that's a real mouthful, but DHA is fine. It's harder to make, but it's essential in the brain and other organs. And I'll just give you a little quick, I think I've got time for a little quick story. So it's very hard to do dietary experiments on people because you say, well, please eat this, that, or the other, and then we'll check on your health. But people have trouble staying on certain kinds of recommended diets. And so the only way you can really do good nutritional work with people is to put them in a metabolic ward in a hospital. You keep them in the metabolic ward and you control what they eat. That's very expensive and it's hardly ever done in human studies. They're good if you can get them done, but generally you get small numbers because it's so expensive, and NIH isn't interested in nutrition. So anyway, it's much easier to control if you give people a pill, right? So that's what NIH usually likes, is give people a pill rather than deal with their diet. So people are interested in nutrition and health turn to animals, right? And the most common animal they go to is rats. So if you take a rat colony and you take half of them and you put them on what's called the soda pop diet, what that is 15% fructose in their drinking water. You don't change anything else. You don't change their diet. You don't change their cages. You don't change how many rats there are in a cage. You don't change their toys if they have toys. It's all kinds of things, but there's several studies like this. And what you find is the rats on the soda pop diet versus the straight water develop fatty liver. They develop cirrhosis. They develop type 2 diabetes very quickly, but they develop cognitive decline. You can train rats to do things, but these rats just can't remember, even though they want to remember, because like a water maze is one of the things you train them on. They have to remember where the little platform under the water is, or they have to keep swimming and swimming and swimming. And so they're motivated to try to find that little platform, but they can't remember where it was. Whereas the control rats just swim right to it. I could show you a video on that. I don't have time for that, but it's quite striking. But if you give the little rats DHA at the same time as a soda pop diet, they still get fatty liver, but they don't get type 2 diabetes and they don't get cognitive decline. So DHA is an antidote to a bad diet. If you took 3 DHA pills after your Cinnabon, you might be okay. I don't recommend doing it that way. I recommend skipping the Cinnabon, but it certainly would help. Okay, so this DHA is incredible stuff. Not only is it essential for your brain, but it's important for the health of your entire body. And I could go on and on and on in this. Okay, so here's why DHA is so important in the brain. So your brain runs on what are called synapses, where one brain cell talks to another brain cell. Okay, and you've got billions of these synapses in your brain. And when you learn new things, you develop new synapses. But half the membranes in these synapses are made out of DHA. And people don't seem to know this, most people. And if you don't have enough DHA, the body puts in other fatty acids that don't work as well. And so your brain isn't working right, and you feel anxiety, depression, and you get cognitive decline, just like those poor little rats. Okay? And so DHA is really important. Okay, so omega-6 produces inflammation. You need it in moderate amounts. You need some. You need 2.5 times 6 to 3. But if you have too many 6s, the body has excess inflammation. And excess inflammation leads to a wide range of health problems. Asthma, allergies, I mentioned some of these before, headaches, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, osteoporosis, large fraction of cancers. I could go on and on and on. The brain, though, is starved for key nutrients required for proper functioning. You risk anxiety, depression, alcoholism, drug dependence, ADHD, Alzheimer's, and on and on and on. Okay? So that's the 6-to-3 balance. So here's a little bit of data, okay, as a reference. So this is cardiovascular deaths per 100,000 people. And this is plotting down here N3, and I've been using omega-3. I should mention here, N3 is another name for omega-3. And they're the same thing. It's just different notation. And when people are typing things, it's a lot easier to type N than find the symbols on your word processor and find that little omega, which is a little curly W, right? It's a Greek letter. So most people actually use N3, but the real purists use omega-3. Okay? So what do we got here? We've got a wide range of fatty acids of these N3 fatty acids. They're called long-chain fatty acids. Here's the Greenland Eskimos have the highest, and they're way down in heart disease deaths, okay? So it's a big effect, and the Japanese are also in pretty good shape. Here's the USA up here. So low long-chain omega-3s, high death from heart disease. But it's not genetic. You say, well, the Greenland Eskimos have better genes, and so the Japanese. Greenland Eskimos that eat a traditional high-fat, high in N3 diet, very low heart type 2 diabetes. But it turns out that Denmark owns Greenland. So it's very easy for these Eskimos to leave Greenland and move to Denmark. And when they do that, they can't get their very high omega-3 diet. You know, they eat blubber for breakfast sometimes, right? And very high, all these fish products are very high in omega-3, and they just can't get their blubber for breakfast in Denmark. And so, or they can stay in Greenland and switch over to the Western diet, and they move up this heart disease incident line, just like everybody else. And rural Japanese have low heart disease. But if they move to the city, they double their heart attack rate. If they move to Australia, Europe, or the US, they increase their heart attack risk to the high levels common in those places. So genetics is a small effect. There may be a little effect, but it's not very big, okay? It's mostly what you eat. You are what you eat. You are what you eat. You are what you eat. Now, here's a study. Almost 80,000 women, which were followed for 20 years, found the intake of saturated fat was not significant. I'm so excited here, I can't pronounce these words. Let me slow down. Was not statistically significant predictor of heart disease. And the same group found that half as much heart disease if people had high ALA omega-3 in their diet. Okay, separate study, but separate paper. But what do we got up here? We've got some little things underlined in red. There's only been one study in the US. Here's the average US heart disease and low of a correlating, one study in the US correlating heart disease and how much omega-3 people had in their bodies. It's called the Mr. Fit study. And these underlined ones, the Q's are quintile. So here, this quintile, the 20% that had the lowest, highest omega-3, sorry, had the lowest heart disease. The quintile, the 20% that had the lowest omega-3 had the highest heart disease. And here's Q2, Q3, Q4. I just underlined a few of them. So that's the only study ever done in the US, and it seems to ring the bells. Postpartum depression. You've probably heard of this. A woman has a baby and she's, wants to be real happy, but she's depressed. So what does this correlate with? This is a measure of DHA in the milk. And the DHA in the milk, it's easy to take a milk sample from a mother that's just delivered, and you measure the DHA, and there's a huge correlation in postpartum depression, okay? And it's a lot of scatter. There's probably other factors. But here's Germany's way up there, and Australia and South Africa, wow. Here are the Asian countries, and there's Chile is pretty good. And but you know, here's Canada, Spain, United Kingdom, Italy, so forth. USA is a little low on this. You might say, what's going on there? The data says that 25% of the women in the US are on antidepressant pharmaceuticals. Maybe that's accounting for a little bit lower here. But the reason for this is the fetus, if the mother doesn't have enough DHA, then the fetus sucks it out of the mother because the fetus, you know, needs it to make a brain. Okay? Now, most pregnant women are given these little pills of nutrient supplements. Can't remember the name, but they're typically given to women who are pregnant by their doctors. But there's too little DHA in those pills. There's a tiny amount in there. There's only maybe 10% of what they should have. The pills probably vary a little bit. But the doctors just don't know. They just don't know. It's a tragedy. Okay, so this be so easy. Costs about $25 a month for the little pills with the purified DHA, with no mercury, no PCBs, nothing else in there. And that's for a typical person or a kid. Now, if you're pregnant, I'd take twice those for maybe $50 a month. So here's a relationship. There's not been a lot of studies of students in, particularly in college, but this was a study where they were going to give the college students DHA and EPA and do a cognitive test on them. But when you start this, you have, you test where people start, right, before you start supplementing. So pre-supplementation, they took samples of blood and they measured. And what they found before people started taking the supplement, they found this cognitive score correlated with how much DHA they had, right? Pretty darn good correlation coefficient. There's probably a few other things going on as well because there's some scatter. If you look at EPA, it looks like you shot a shotgun at the paper, right? So it's really not correlated at all. So EPA is good stuff, but it's not affecting the brain function for cognitive testing. So then if I'll show you, oh, here's more. Okay, so there have been many studies in school kids. There was one in Oxford, England, where they supplemented a whole elementary school. They had 400 kids they supplemented, and another 400 were on placebo pills, which looked the same as the supplement pills, but they didn't have the active ingredient in them. And they found that all the kids improved in school performance, but the lowest performing kids improved the most. And furthermore, the parents ranked the behavior improvements absolutely spectacularly. P-value is 0.001, and I don't remember all the rankings, but the parents, see, it was double blind. The parents didn't know if their kids were getting the good pill or the empty pill, right? And so the parents noted tremendous improvements in behavior. And so we were studying this stuff, and I don't have time to go into the full details, but one of the things, we saw this study in Oxford, England, where the low-performing kids improved the most. And so one of my colleagues in Health and Human Development had a very good connections with many of the Indian reservations, and we had trouble getting money for this, but we finally got money for a pilot study for 3 months, and we got this lined it up with a community advisory board for this one relatively small school on an Indian reservation. And we didn't have a placebo group here because the parents and the other community members didn't want to give any of the kids empty pills, right? So what they had reading scores on the kids every month for many of them for years. And so we used each kid, their prior reading scores as their own control. It's called a longitudinal study. It's a fine, defensible way to do. And what this is there are 3 tiers of reading level, okay? There's above grade level, near grade level, and below grade level. And so what we're plotting here is the ratio of the number of kids that were reading above grade level to below grade level, okay? And so here's bouncing around the year before supplementation. And then when we supplemented at these red star points, this was a treatment group. And look at the enormous improvement of students reading above the grade level. And there was a big drop in students reading below grade level. That's really cool. Now, there was another factor in here that I couldn't plot so easily. And the school principal was really behind this study. She called it the Feed the Brain campaign. So she was able to get the parents or guardians of about half the parents or guardians of the kids, half the kids in the school, to sign these consent forms. And they're a 2-page thing. They look a little legalistic. And so here are these white people coming to give their Indian kids pills, and I'm not so keen on this, but the principal said, boy, this is really good. You should get your kid on this, and let's try it, Feed the Brain. So she signed up pretty much half of each class across kindergarten to 8th grade. But what she did that we didn't know was she particularly talked to the parents or guardians of the troublesome kids. These were the kids that were getting thrown out of class and sent to the principal. So the principal would give them a stern talking to, as principals do, and send them back. And then in a few days or a week or something, they'd be back again. They just go around and around and around. And she'd occasionally crack a nut, but not that often. Okay. So she got all of these troublesome kids on this supplement program. And doggone it, after a month of supplementation, she had fewer kids showing up at her office. After 2 months, hardly any. After 3 months of supplementation, she hadn't seen a kid thrown out of class in her office for a couple of weeks. Not one. And so the teacher said the classes were a happier place, and even the non-supplemented kids improved a little, not as much as the supplemented kids. So the green line here is the whole school. And see, the green line went up too. And then there's this year after the supplementation, the kids were doing better too. And we didn't prove that that's happening, but it makes sense, because if you get these DHAs into the synapses, when the brain is learning new things, it stays there for a long, long, long time. Maybe, we don't know exactly, maybe 20, 30 years. So just giving them a little shot of it made it easier for them to learn the following year. Now, we'd love to continue this. Indian Reservation says, hey, let's supplement all our schools. Well, we went to the National Institutes of Health, which is the main support mechanism for biological research in the US. And I've probably raised more NIH money than anybody on campus, partially because I've been at it for a longer time, but I've served on lots of review panels and I know how to do this. And we got turned down at every turn. And we tried all kinds of things, and I could go on and on about that, but I don't want to take time for that. So, okay. If we had NIH is not interested in nutrition. If we had a new pill to give to the kids that was going to improve their school performance, now we'd have millions of dollars pouring into our research. So what we're doing now is we're going to private foundations, which we think some of them might be more interested in really having an impact with this kind of data. And I say this reservation where we did this want to supplement all their schools. Several other reservations have heard about this and they want to do it too. And so we're going to go fight for more money. We're still working on that. Okay. But this is very promising. Okay. So here's kind of a little complex thing, but it'll help you understand. So here's the omega-3 side, and here's the omega-6 side. And there's a lot of biochemistry that goes on. And in our bodies, we can make the omega-3s from the short ones in our diet into the long ones that are more powerful. So here's the omega-6 side. And it goes down to something called arachidonic acid, very powerful hormones. And they cause inflammation, and they also cause pain. So the omega-3 is anti-inflammatory and reduces the risk of cancer, arthritis, osteoporosis, type 2 diabetes. So we need omega-6 driven inflammation for a healthy immune system, but it can be too aggressive. So if you take an aspirin or Tylenol or whatever you might take for pain, what it's doing is blocking this arachidonic acid pain mechanism. That's what it does. Okay, now where do these, let's see, here's a little more complicated, but let's just do this first. Where do the 6 come from? Linoleic acid, corn, soy, sunflower, safflower, peanut, all nut oils. Chickens, most chickens, if you buy a chicken, you think it's healthy, but it's got too much 6 and not enough 3 because it's fed corn and soy, unless you can find a pasture-raised chicken or you go shoot a wild pheasant or duck or something. Over here, there's very few plants that have high omega-3 plant oils. Flax, you've all heard of. Chia camelina is one that Dave Sands is developing for, it's very high in, it's as high in omega-3 as flax. And they also grass-fed animals and wild game over here because the grass has got to have omega-3. Now, flax is very hard to use because, you know, it's a very hard little seed. And if you eat flax seeds, they just go right through you and you never get anything out of them. So you have to grind the flax in order to make the omega-3 accessible. But then when you grind the flax, those omega-3 fatty acids go rancid very rapidly. And so you have to, if you're going to try to feed animals, say, I'm going to make healthy animals, I'm going to feed them flax. You could do that. You could take a feedlot animal and feed them flax, and that would greatly improve their animal's health and their value, the nutritional value of the animal products. But you'd have to grind that flax fresh every day because the meal, once it's ground, if it's consumed right away, it's fine, but it goes rancid. And so it's very hard to do. You know, you could do it, but you'd have to grind it fresh every day. Now, Dave came up with this camelina, which is long been used in Europe, particularly as an oil product. And it's wonderful. It's got as good omega-3 as flax, but it's also got something else. It's got very high vitamin E. So it's a hard little seed too. But if you grind the camelina, it goes into the meal. It's got so much vitamin E, it doesn't go rancid for, I don't know, weeks or months, depending on how you're storing it. So it's much easier to use as a feed. And Dave may have talked about that a little bit. I don't know. So here's even a little more complicated, but it's built on that. So see, when we take the ALA and the linoleic acid, they compete for the same enzymes. So these are longer. Remember, these got 18 carbons, both of these. This has got 20 carbons, and the DHA has got 22 carbons. So we have to put in more double bonds. So these are 3 and 2 double bonds. Arachidonic acid ends up with 4 double bonds, and EPA and DHA are 5 and 6 double bonds. So these enzymes can do this. They can make them longer, and they can put in double bonds, but the same enzymes work on 6 and 3. So if you got too much 6, then they hog the enzymes, and the little bit of 3 you got gets left out. Okay, and so this is a big deal. And sorry, the slide's a little complicated, but let me mention, for example, I mentioned that the ideal 6 to 3 is around 2.5. Peanut butter is 450 to 1. 450. You want 2.5, 450. What do a lot of little kids eat? Peanut butter jelly on white bread. Oh, man. They ought to have 5 DHA pills every time they did that. And a lot of the kids are bouncing off the walls, right? You may have seen that, all right? And so you can eat peanut butter, but you better have the antidote, to stabilize your brain and the inflammation all throughout your body, okay? Now, you can get fish, but farmed fish, bottom feeders, like tilapia and catfish, actually are fed corn and soy. So, if you have a farmed salmon or farmed halibut, it's not as good as wild, but any salmon is better than no salmon. And they have to feed them omega-3, ALA, in order for the salmon to survive. So they're not quite as good as the wild, but they're better than no salmon, okay? So, all right. So what's happened, the level of 6 over the last 100 years? Omega-6 has gone up and up and up, and it gives higher shelf life in processed foods. Whereas 3 has been brought down and down and down because it causes shorter shelf life. It's much more fragile. Okay? So here's the 6 going up because they have to have oil in their products, and the 3 goes down. There's been a little bounce fairly recently because some people are beginning to become aware that 3 is really important. But here's historically, the traditional foods, if you really were relying on wild game and grass-fed animals, the 3 would be way up here. And even 100 years ago, it wasn't as high as it could have been. So here's a paper you can find to look at if you want. That's very important. So the 6 has been going up, and the 3 has been going down. And what the saying you can, some people say, oh, I know these fatty acids are important, but I can't remember which is the important one, okay? So the little thing you can say to yourself is nix the 6, N-I-X, nix the 6, underneath the 3. Nix the 6, okay? So you can avoid this 6, but you have to. How am I doing? Is this not working?
You could go on and on.
Oh, you want to stop now?
Well, if they're going to ask questions.
Okay, so let me go through one thing here. One more thing, okay? So inflammation driving all these things drives 2/3 of cancers, okay? And here's a long-term 20-year study. There's 3 of these where you've probably heard that baby aspirin is good to avoid heart disease. Well, they followed up on these people. That's true. And the baby aspirin reduces inflammation from too much 6. But they followed these people after they did the heart disease study. What they found is the people that continued the aspirin had 3 times lower cancer just with a baby aspirin. Now, I don't take baby aspirin because I nix the 6. I don't eat much of any 6. I have a little. And so I don't just must mess with the baby aspirin. You don't need it if you watch your diet. So let me get to one more slide before we do. So U.S. isn't really in such good health. We rank number 18 of obesity. Here's a website you can find out what the 6-to-3 ratio is. And if you can increase 3 and reduce 6, healthier, happier, more functional people, nix the 6. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, that was a little bit like going to church.
You're not coming through very loud.
That was a little bit like going to church. Yeah. But
questions?
We do know that diet affects you. What's interesting is we're an educational institution. If we could raise your IQ 5 points.
10 points, 20 points, 50 points.
Maybe 50 points. That would be really cool. So we have these dining halls. We have ways to do that. It seems to me, if I were an educator, I would want to talk to very receptive students who can have their own ideas and do their own thinking.
Yep.
Is that true?
Sure. Yeah, now people will say, well, I'm going to go off to Costco and buy a big bottle of fish oil, right? I'm going to get healthy. The problem is that plain old fish oil could have mercury, could have PCBs, and it also gives people fish burps. But most of the stuff in there is not the DHA EPA. The companies purify the DHA and EPA in little pills and get rid of the mercury and PCBs. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking now and give you guys a chance to ask questions.